So let's go through the 50s because Diners Club started, and then what was next? Show us. I'd love to see some more examples if you have
Okay.
anything else. Yeah.
So I guess it wasn't too many years after Diners Club started. They were becoming more and more popular, more and more used. American Express uh, saw, they had their traveler's checks,
Mm.
and they saw this growing credit card business as it's going to affect their traveler's check business. So
Interesting.
that's why they decided that they had to. And there were several years. There was a couple of other companies. In fact, before American Express, there were several other companies that started their own cup card. There was Esquire Club, which is Esquire Magazine, had a credit card. Uh, the Duncan Hines Signet Club, which was named after the Duncan Hines of the cake mix
Sure.
name. And there was a Gourmet Guest Club had a credit card that was from Gourmet Magazine. So everybody, because of Diners Club was growing so much, everybody was trying to get in on it. But none of them were very successful. They were always small. When American Express decided to get into it in 1958, this was a big company with a lot of money,
Uh huh.
and they were the ones that really were the first serious competition to Diners Club. And when American Express issued their first card in '58, pretty much all these other smaller companies either got bought by Diners Club or by American Express pretty quickly, and it consolidated down to those two
Really? Yeah.
companies in the what you would call, and that category is called the travel and entertainment cards,
Okay.
is what they were generally called, as opposed to a bank card. They were travel and entertainment cards because they were mostly used by executives uh, for travel, for business use. Um, Not as much, by stores or things like that. It was mostly hotels, restaurants, airlines,
Yeah.
really that type of
And
thing.
Diners Club is still issued, just not in the United States, but they're still
Right.
both of those American Express and Diners Club are still seen as premium products, like they're
Sure.
premium card products. And it sounds like they always have been.
Right. Right. And,
Yeah.
and so here's the uh, paper American Express card. They were first issued in September of 1958. So they were first mailed out, and they just issued these paper cards for 1 year, and then they switched
One
to
year.
plastic, depending on when you applied. Yeah, but I guess it really was just for 6 months that they issued the paper card,
Oh,
because
really? Okay.
they did switch to plastic, sometime after April of 1959.
Now, were they the first to issue plastic cards?
A lot of places on the internet will say that the American Express card was the first plastic credit card. But I think because it was their first plastic credit card,
Mm,
that kind of people took that as being the first plastic credit card.
yeah.
And the first plastic credit cards, that's a subject that's I've studied a lot. I don't have a definitive answer, but it was sometime around 1955, 1956
Okay.
when,
Yeah.
uh, and the important uh, thing about that is there were some plastic type cards before that, but what was important about that was that they had come up with a plastic that could be embossed.
Wow.
That was the big technological advancement. They figured out a thickness of plastic that could be embossed. It wasn't going to crack or break. You could put it in your wallet,
Yeah.
um,
That's yeah.
and it
It's interesting to think of because right now, cards, credit cards, the thickness is very specific, and you know, we, I've always just imagined that it has to be the perfect size so that it can be slid through the slot in a certain way. But I wonder if it's actually the thickness has more to do with the embossing, and that just has retain, that
I think,
thickness,
yeah.
or yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it all had to do with embossing to come up with the right. Now the size, and there were some early cards that were a little bigger, a little smaller.
Mm.
Um, I'm not sure. There was a size card called the princess sized card, I don't know if I have one of those, but it was a smaller card. A lot of department stores used that size card. Um, but most the gas companies and most of the banks mostly used the regular standard size card that's still in use today.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's almost by chance the size card we have today, the thickness of the card, all of that just it was set so long ago. It may or may not have a specific reason. We've just kind of maintained
Right.
those standards since then.
Like the American Express paper card, it's bigger than a standard size card.
Oh, is it?
So, it would not fit in the average, you
Right.
know, man's wallet of the time. But yeah, I guess that's some stuff that's hard to figure out.
Yeah.
I don't know the definitive answers on some of that.
Now with the plastic, and you'd mentioned this before, there's you there's holes and there's some examples you have where it looks like it's almost like a computer type.
Yes, I've got a few examples of that. Like this card is probably from the 1970s. This is a
Okay.
Montgomery Ward card, and it has the holes, like the IBM key punch
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
uh, cards, and this particular type of card was actually used with a certain NCR cash register, and it's got the cut corner, so the correct way to put it on
Right.
it like laid down on the register, and light went through the holes and read the account number,
Oh,
and then it transferred that to the receipt. Now, before that, back starting around 1960, there was another. Now, I hope this shows up, but there are some in the hobby, we call those computer bumps. There's some
okay.
rectangular embossed bumps that
Right.
coincide with the number, and I've seen cards as early as 1960 that now they weren't read by the register, but those bumps were imprinted onto the carbon paper
Mm-hmm.
just like the numbers were, and then they had computers that could read these series
Ah,
of bumps, so they were
interesting.
able to automate
Right.
they ran the receipts that were sent in to a central billing office. They ran them through some kind of, and the computer could read them
Yeah.
and do all the billing and send out the bills.
It's interesting because, like we, kind of talked about this before with the coins, where it was manually writing something down to calling someone and verifying account information, and moving forward to having some automation. It just seems like the industry was attempting to insert automation into this process from the
Sure, sure.
very beginning.
Yes, and it is these companies got bigger, and like gas companies had stations all across the country. They had to come up with a way to automate it somewhat. It was just, you can imagine how much paperwork and how much manpower it
Right.
took to
Absolutely.
to do all that billing,
Right.
manually.
Um. So we have what happened in the 50s and all the cards that came out. um do you have, I'm curious, so MasterCharge became MasterCard,
Right.
Bank AmeriCard became Visa. You have any early examples of some of those transitions?
Yes. Well, let me show you first. So this is an interesting card. This is the Chase Manhattan Charge Plan. They were first issued around 1958. Same time American Express, Bank AmeriCard. So obviously Chase is
Mm,
still in the business today
sure.
in a
Right,
pretty
right.
big way. So this is Chase's first credit card. This is what it looked like, the Chase Manhattan Charge Plan.
Interesting.
Um, and this is a very special card. So this is a Bank AmeriCard. This expired in March of 1959,
Okay.
and they were issued in September of 1958 for the first time. So this is the first card that ended up being Visa. This is the first one, and I just know of a couple of these in existence.
And that's
So these were
plastic, obviously.
yes, Bank of America started out with plastic.
Okay.
The Bank of America did a test market and you can find a lot of this information about, it's pretty well known. In Fresno, California, in September of 1958, they did a test market in that town to see if the card would be successful. And they pretty quickly extended it all over California. But for a long time, it was only in California until they started adding other banks.
In that test market, no applications, right? They just mailed those.
They just mailed those to anybody that had a Bank of America checking account. And I guess they did a credit check. And they went around and got as many merchants, before they even issued the card, as many merchants as they could to get them signed up to accept the card. Yeah. And they got them to accept the card by telling them, we're just going to send this card out. Everybody's got a checking account. Bank of America had a pretty big market share in California, period, at the time.
Right.
So if they sent one out to every checking account customer they had, it was a lot of people, in that town. So that's how they got, and this cards went out like unsolicited. Right. A live card came in the mail to you, ready to use, with a credit limit, and they could do that up until about 1970 or 1971. Banks or stores, anybody could send out a live card. That wasn't outlawed until around 1970 or 71. Whether you had to, apply or send in something first. They couldn't just send out a card, because obviously a lot of cards were stolen and used, and there weren't any laws in place yet to protect you from fraudulent credit card use. So I know there was a lot of problems with that.
So
early on.
So back then, you could potentially have an unsolicited card sent to you. Someone could take that and steal it and go use it, and there's nothing protecting you from liability in a sense.
Not a specific law. Now, I imagine they were able to argue a way out of that, probably. But it was also new.
Right.
It was something new. They hadn't got around to making the laws yet.
Now we have prepaid, debit. You mentioned phone cards earlier, but we have cards to access available funds. We have charge cards, credit cards, metal cards. Anything else between then and maybe the 80s or 90s that was interesting that kind of talks to the evolution of how we've gotten to where we are.
Now, obviously, the magnetic strip is a important, probably the biggest technological change, and that is very hard to figure out. You do some research on magnetic stripes. Who had the first one? There's a lot of people that claim they invented it. There's a lot of, and it's hard to tell who had the first magnetic stripe on a card. It was somewhere in the late 60s, 68, 69, 70, in that time frame is when they started being used.
So when Bank of America went out, it was the same as others. Either it was taking carbon paper to read the embossing and to store that and to get a signature, or someone was writing it. And then at some point, the magnetic stripe was intended to automate all of that. So the idea when they swiped that card, even in the 60s, was there some communication happening?
Initially, the magnetic stripe was put on the cards so they could be used in an ATM machine.
Ah, I see.
That was around late 1960s is when ATM machines first started being used, and that was the primary use of the magnetic stripe. Now, sometime in the early 70s, there were different experiments, test pilot programs for point-of-sale authorization. Yeah. There was a way they took the phone through the phone line, and they had a box there, and they put the phone down on the on the box, and had the buttons they pushed where it was charged, and then they called in to some kind of early point-of-sale authorization. But that came along probably more into the mid 70s, I would say, before that became more
Okay.
common.
So the magnetic stripes added mostly for the ATMs, and then obviously there's some transition, or the value is seen in that as a way to make purchases. I remember, I've been in banking for a little over 20 years. When I first started, we were still selling. I mean, we were still distributing what they call the knuckle busters, like the little
Right.
things to read the cards, and that really wasn't that long ago. And I imagine you might still see some of those around. Technically, I assume that they're a valid way to pay.
But yeah, there probably are a few out there somewhere in some small stores. Yeah,
Yeah.
when I worked at Sears when I was in college, and if the card there were some people still people that had cards that didn't have the magnetic stripe, and
Mm,
we had to imprint those cards. If they
right.
didn't have the magnetic stripe. Where I work now, we take credit cards, and it still comes up if we manually put in the account number if we don't have the customer in the
Hmm.
in there with us, and we're manually putting it still comes up on that machine imprint card
It's
to this
crazy.
day. But nobody's had an imprint
Nobody
for a
would
long
know
time,
what
but
to
it
do, right?
it
Yeah.
still comes up on there. It says imprint card. If you choose that the card is not present when
It's
you're
crazy.
making a
Yeah.
charge. I think that's pretty funny. But
Well, um, anything else? Anything we missed? And I'm trying to think. I have some. I have. I would love to see any other examples of cards you have. I have a couple here that I was gonna share. Nothing compared to what you have, of course, but some interesting products. And I can't find my payment ring, but now there's wearables, there's rings you can pay with, contactless bracelets, and everything's kind of changing a little bit.
sure. Let
But
me go back. I have a
yeah,
couple of pieces here
yeah,
before
yeah.
back to the '60s to the bank cards. Um, so Bank of America it becomes is doing well in California. At the
Hmm.
time, there were banking laws where you couldn't uh, um, do business in another state. I'm not sure when all
Oh
that state,
yeah.
the interstate banking laws or
Uh
whatever they
huh.
called them. And so Bank of America decided to franchise, I guess you would say, the Bank AmeriCard program to other banks in other states.
Ah,
This
interesting.
happened around 1966 when they started doing this. There was probably 8 or 10 banks in different cities, Philadelphia. Um, I'd have to think a minute some of the other. But anyway, there were about a dozen other banks that started issuing Bank AmeriCards. And some other banks in California found out that they were about to do this, and they decided they needed to get together and start their own credit card program. There were four banks: Wells Fargo, which is obviously still a
Hmm.
major player
Sure.
in this country, and there were three other banks. They're probably all changed names. Like this was in
Wow.
July of 1967 when they first sent out MasterCharge cards, and this is one from
Yeah.
Wells. So this is going to be one of the first. This expired in November of '67. This is going to be one of the first MasterCharge cards ever issued.
So the Interbank card, and it was so I guess I did not realize it was created as a way to compete against how quickly Bank AmeriCard was growing.
That's right. And coincidentally, over on the East Coast, there were a group of banks actually that got together to form a credit card program, and that was really Interbank. It was on
Hmm.
the East Coast. A group of
Oh, I
seven
see.
or eight banks got together in 1966 in Buffalo, New York. There was a company called Midland Bank that was a big New York bank. They were kind of
Hmm.
one of the main ones that got everybody together, and they found out what MasterCharge was doing in California, and they linked up, and that's how MasterCharge became an Interbank card, and
I
they
see.
had the I on the back there,
Yeah.
and so that meant if you got issued this card in California, you could go to these other cities for the first time and use this card in another state. Because Bank of America was doing the same thing, so they decided they needed to get together and compete with Bank of America. So
That's intriguing. So MasterCharge was not called the Interbank card when it was first launched. It was just MasterCharge.
it was just because it was coincidentally they just started around the same
I
time,
see.
and
Right.
they kind of that's
Join
a whole
forces.
interesting story. Yeah, they kind of joined forces early on. Wanted to show this other now. Some of the banks were still not all of them were not going with Bank of America yet or with MasterCharge. Some of them were still trying to keep their own card, and
Mm.
yeah. So this is the first National City Everything card from around, I think, 1967.
It
This
has
is
the same
Citibank.
colors as the Bank America card almost.
Yeah, and I don't know how they got away with that because
Yeah, right.
there was no connection, but it was they were obviously trying to compete with them.
Right,
But
sure.
this is Citibank's. Uh, they're
Oh,
obviously still
interesting.
a big
Yeah.
player, in the
Huge.
business. This was their first bank card that they
Right.
issued. Although they did buy carte blanche early on
Ah,
and owned them for
they
a
did.
few years.
Yeah.
They tried several different ways to get into the credit card business in the
Right.
'60s. I think there was an antitrust issue, and they made them sell carte blanche
I
because
see.
of that. That's when they issued their everything card. It just lasted a few years, and then they um, started issuing master charges. So by the
I see.
by the early '70s, just about every bank. There was a few exceptions that kept their own bank card, local bank card, but just about all the banks either went with the Bank of America card or with MasterCharge,
Well,
pretty
that's
much.
interesting. Yeah, and that's still the way it is today for the most part.
Right, right.
Especially with
Most of the
debit and yeah.
sure. Most of the banks that had a already had some kind of credit card program in place, most of them went with MasterCharge. The banks that had not been in the business at all, most of them went with Bank AmeriCard,
Interesting.
because MasterCharge was more of a loose association of the
Mm,
banks, where Bank AmeriCard was a little more. They pretty much they used to use their whole program completely. And if
I
you're
see.
starting from scratch, you use the Bank AmeriCard program. So,
Any other? Because I know Carte Blanche. If I'm not mistaken, Discover owns them now. I believe.
yeah,
Yeah, there you
here's
go.
an early.
Yeah.
This is not the first one I've got in a frame, so I couldn't get it out. But
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
early '60s, and they were started by Hilton Hotels,
Ah, interesting.
um, because they saw what Diners Club and these other were doing, and they wanted to have a card where
Mm,
they didn't have the people didn't have to use the Diners Club or the American Express
sure.
at their hotel or whatever. So they issued a multi-purpose card. Sheraton almost issued one, but they uh, ended up just going with Diners Club.
I hope you enjoyed that video. What a great group, the ACCCS. Make sure to check them out. The link is in the description below. The link is in the description below. Subscribe, like the video, watch the full video, and we're done.